All right, welcome back. Let's get started on how bone is formed. So, bone is formed via osteogenesis or ossification, and that's the process of bone formation. Our bones are going to form in 4 different situations throughout our life and throughout our body. The first, of course, being embryological and fetal development, so that we can actually have a skeleton and a structure. The second is going to be before adulthood, so as we are growing in length and height. The third will be as our bones remodel, which remodeling is going to be when we just replace our bone throughout our life. And then the fourth situation is, of course, if we actually break or fracture our bones, we need to be able to heal them. So there are 4 situations throughout life in which bone will actually form or go through the process of ossification. This ossification is going to take place in either one of 2 forms. It'll either be intramembranous or it will be endochondrial. In the intramembranous, we have the ossification here from bone from within a fibrous connective tissue. So this generally occurs in our flat bones, and we take this fibrous connective tissue membrane and then we replace it with bone. So as you can see here, we have to have what we call an ossification center from our mesenchymal cells. This ossification center will convert the mesenchymal cells into osteoblast. And the osteoblast will then begin to lay down our extracellular matrix, or this osteoid matrix. That matrix then begins to surround the cells and begins to calcify. And so the process of calcification, where we take calcium and other minerals and salts and deposit them into the matrix, causes it to harden. And our osteoblast type cell, so that builder cell, becomes an osteocyte, or the maintenance type cell. This calcifying matrix will then begin to form bridges of trabeculae, and those bridges of trabeculae will constitute our spongy bone. And so we have these trabeculae with the extracellular matrix turning into spongy bone. And then the final step is we take this spongy bone that has the red bone marrow in it, and we are going to form the periosteum, or an outer collar of spongy bone that we can then replace by the compact bone. So the spongy bone is replaced by a compact bone only on the outer portion here to form more of a collar. So if we think about it, we want the outer portion of our bone to be compact or dense or harder, and the inside is okay to be spongy and contain that red bone marrow. So 4 basic steps. We have our osteoblasts that will develop from the fibrous connective tissue, and then those osteoblasts will turn into an osteocyte after they have been calcified, and then we'll form our trabeculae to create the spongy bone filled with red bone marrow, and then finally on the outer edges we create compact bone to create that periosteum as well. So we create a full bone at this point with spongy bone, compact bone, and a periosteum. Now, our endochondrial ossification, this is when we have the formation of bone from our hyaline cartilage. So intermembranous was from the fibrous connective tissue. Endochondrial is from our hyaline cartilage. And so this is actually going to be most of the bones in our body that will go through endochondrial ossification. So our first step here is going to be developing our cartilage model. And then once we actually take this cartilage model, our mesenchymal cells develop into chondroblast. So chondroblast here, because it is a cartilage cell, so it's a chondro type of cell, versus our osteo, which is bone, so it's a chondroblast that forms the cartilage model. And then we begin to grow this cartilage model by dividing those cells, and so they become chondrocytes here. And so we've started with creating a model, step 1. Step 2, growing the model. And then in step 3, we have to allow a primary ossification center to develop. This primary ossification center will develop in the diaphysis, so the shaft of our long bone. And at the primary ossification center, we begin to remove the cartilage and replace it by bone. And then once we have gone through this primary ossification center, we then need to develop an actual medullary cavity. So we begin to create this marrow cavity by breaking down some of the bone here with the osteoclast. And then finally we'll create us a secondary ossification center, and this secondary ossification center will occur in the epiphysis. So you'll have one in the distal and one in the proximal epiphyses. And when we get this secondary ossification, this is going to create more bone as well in those distal ends of the epiphyses. And then finally, we'll form our articular cartilage and the epiphyseal plate here. So the articular cartilage, so that our bone may actually come into contact or articulate with another bone. And then of course we need this epiphyseal plate so that our bone can actually grow in length over time. And so you see we're showing this in the young fetus here as to how this occurs as we are developing. So endochondral ossification requires us to develop a cartilage model, grow that cartilage model, create a primary ossification center, allow the formation of a medullary cavity, create a secondary ossification center, and then finally form our articular cartilage and our epiphyseal plate. So, as far as how our bones will grow in length, we need to understand the details of our epiphyseal growth plate. So to do that, we've shown some images here of exactly what we have going on at the epiphyseal growth plate. So this endochondral ossification that we talked about, this is going to allow our growth at these epiphyseal growth plates to grow in length. And there are 4 zones that we'll see here. We have the zone of our resting cartilage. We have the zone of our proliferating cartilage. Then the zone of our hypertrophic cartilage. And then the zone of the calcified cartilage. So the zone of the resting cartilage is going to be nearest to the epiphysis, whereas the zone of the calcified cartilage will be closest to the diaphysis. And so the activity of the epiphyseal plate, this is the only, I repeat, the only means by which our diaphysis here can actually increase in length. When this epiphyseal plate closes here, it's going to actually be replaced by what we call an epiphyseal line, and that indicates that our bone has actually completed the growth and length that it can have. So here we see this is actually from a 3-year-old, so there's still an epiphyseal plate, but as we age, that epiphyseal plate will be less space will occur through here, and it'll just be a slightly darker line that will be an epiphyseal line, not a true plate. So here you can see our zones again. You see we're starting the opposite way this time, so we're working from the opposite end of the bone. The resting cartilage is here. We are proliferating the cartilage here. We have some hypertrophic cartilage here, and then finally this calcified cartilage. So this is our epiphyseal plate running through here, and you can see the developing bone in the diaphysis. Now, in width, bone grows through width or thickness or diameter. The growth is considered to be appositional. Appositional growth will occur at the periosteum, so that outer covering of our bone. And we can grow the bone in true diameter from interstitial and this appositional growth. So this adds new bone tissue by osteoblast around the outer surface of the bone, and then to a little lesser extent, the internal bone will dissolve or dissolute by the osteoclast activity in the bone, and that'll create us to widen that canal. So here you see that we have ridges in the periosteum. They'll create some grooves for our periosteal blood vessels, and then these periosteal ridges begin to actually fuse together and create an endosteum lined tunnel. So remember, periosteum is that outer covering of the bone, where endosteum is the internal covering. So by letting these ridges fuse together, we have taken the external portion and made it become internal. So now we have endosteum. And then our osteoclasts that are within this endosteum begin to build new concentric lamellae, or those Haversian canals, or an osteon, and they build those inward towards the center of the tunnel, creating their osteon. And so finally, our bone will begin to grow outward as the osteoblasts that are in the periosteum build new circumferential lamellae, and we create osteons, and we keep repeating this process to fold over the blood vessels as we go, and our bone can grow appositionally. So this is how oftentimes we'll get the remodeling that occurs with our orthodontics. So when you have braces that go on, we stress the teeth. And when you stress the teeth by placing the braces on, it causes the bones within the jaw to remodel. So here we see this bone growth and width again. So this slide was showing us how we needed this periosteum and the blood supply to create the new osteons. This slide is showing us how we said we had to have those osteoblasts creating the bone on the outer area, but then within we had to have osteoclasts actually destroying some of the bone from the medullary cavity. Okay, let's see. Quick break here because my computer's trying to update. All right, back to our bone growth and width. So the osteoclast will actually come in and destroy some of the inner part of the medullary cavity, and now you see our bone has gotten wider in the diameter here. Remember, these are great interactions, especially as we begin to talk about processes that will actually create or work with actions. And so then we also have our bone remodeling. And so in bone remodeling, this is simply where we replace old bone with new bone tissue. And so this happens via osteoclast activity. So the old bone will be destroyed by the osteoclast. Remember, these are the cells that break down things. So this osteoclast will break down the bone. And then new bone will be formed by osteoblasts. So, as we said, during orthodontia or during the wear of braces, this is what allows our teeth to actually move and shift by breaking down that old bone and creating it with new bone. So there are some factors that will, of course, affect our bone remodeling and our bone growth. So, as you know, when you were young and growing, we talked about certain vitamins and minerals you should take so that you could grow strong and older. And then as you age, on the other hand, we still talk about a lot of these vitamins and minerals so that you can protect your bones. So obviously calcium and phosphorus are necessary because they are by far the larger deposits of our bones. And so we also need other minerals in smaller amounts. And then we need some vitamins to help us with our bone growth. We need vitamin C, vitamin K, vitamin B12, and vitamin A. As we're growing as children, we need certain hormones such as insulin like growth factors, which is stimulated by the human growth hormone for us to have strong bones. And then as we're children and as we are adults, we need thyroid hormones and insulin. Those are necessary for our bone growth. Then once we reach puberty, the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, will actually create that sudden growth. That's how we get that growth spurt at puberty. And they'll also create some modifications to create more so of our male and our female forms. So we do know that hormones can affect your growth and height. If you are deficient in human growth hormone as a child, you may end up with what we call dwarfism, pituitary dwarfism, because you're not producing enough of it to grow. And then on the other hand, if you're over secreting or have a hyper secretion of human growth hormone as a child, that results in giantism. Now, how do we repair our fractures? So fracture is going to be any break that occurs in our bone. And this fracture actually has 3 phases, but it will occur in 4 steps. So in the second phase, we have 2 steps. And so in this healing process, we have the reactive phase. And this is where at the site of the fracture, we create a hematoma. So we are reacting to our break by creating that hematoma or that blood clot there. And then in the reparative phase, this is where the 2 steps will occur. So we are going to create this fracture hematoma in the first reactive phase, and it will then begin to grow into granulation tissue in a process called procallus, or this granulation tissue is called the procallus. And then this procallus will then be transformed here into our fibrocartilaginous callus, or a soft callus. And this soft callus, or this fibrocartilaginous callus here, will then convert into our spongy bone. And so it'll begin with spongy bone, and eventually this spongy bone will convert into a hard callus. And finally, we'll take that hard callus and we'll remodel it to actually heal our bone to nearly what we originally started with before our fracture. Excuse me. So we'll have our reactive phase, form this fracture hematoma, and form a procallus. The procallus then needs to become our fibrocartilaginous callus, and this fibrocartilaginous callus will then start to develop into spongy bone, and then that spongy bone hardens into our compact or our hard bony callus. And then finally we go through the process of remodeling, where we take away some of the old bone and create new bone and create a bone that was similar to what we started with. And so we have several treatments for fractures. We know that this process, this healing process, will occur regardless. And so sometimes we need to step in and go through some of these treatments so that we make sure this process happens as it as it should, so that we create a bone similar to what we started with. Because we can break our bone or fracture our bone and it not stay aligned and this process still occur, and then we end up with more of a bone that, instead of aligning from our break on top of one another or in alignment as we're showing here, we end up with our bone actually forming back together, but it will begin to form in a process that is not in alignment, and thus eventually we will have more issues. So part of our treatment can be the anatomic realignment of bone fractures, and so that's where we actually need to go in and recreate or surgically repair and anatomically realign those fragments. Or we can have the immobilization to maintain realignment. So this is where you break your bone and they just place you in a cast, but you don't require surgery for your healing. That would be immobilization to maintain alignment. And the last is restoration of function. So that would be going through the physical therapy aspect that goes on for us with bone. So we have several different types of fractures that are common. We have our open fracture. This is where we break the bone and it protrudes through the skin. So it has to be open here by breaking through the skin. If it does not break through the skin, but it breaks through the entire shaft of the bone, then that is what we call a simple fracture. So these open fractures are compound, meaning that they include the bone and the skin. Now our comminuted fracture, this is where we crush the bone. It's a splintered crushing type of fracture, and this is where oftentimes we still have two main fragments, but then we have some smaller fragments in between. This is oftentimes where you can see bone being lost other places in the body, in the skin. So if you have this comminuted fracture, a lot of these fragments may end up dislodging themselves throughout the arm or other places. And so sometimes in those type of surgeries, depending on how big the portion of the fragment is, they may have to remove that portion. Now, a green stick fracture is going to be a special type of fracture. It's only one side of the bone is broken. So I think it's best seen here in this radiograph, where it begins to break in one side, but it doesn't break through and through like our compound fracture did. And so it got its name because if you think about like a little green twig, it breaks in a similar way, bends on one side but stays whole on the other. So this can only occur in children whose bones have not fully ossified and they have more organic than inorganic material. So special type of fracture only occurs in children. And then our impacted fracture, this is where we're going to drive one end of the bone into the other end forcefully. So when we fracture the bone here, we end up driving the broken part into the cavity of the other end. So it's a very forceful type of fracture. And then we have our pot fracture and our Coles fractures. The pot fracture is where the pot fracture is a special one. It has to happen at certain places in the body. So where we fracture the distal end of our fibula, and so it causes an injury with how the fibula is articulated to the tibia. And then We also have the Coles fracture, and this Coles fracture is going to be at the distal end of the forearm at our radius, and it's going to displace our radius posteriorly. So, two special fractures occurring at special places. So, now how does our bone store our calcium? So, this will bring us into the very last part here of the chapter. But the bone will store calcium because we know that it deposits those minerals. It's going to store 99% of our calcium here in the body. And so most of our calcium is stored here. There is some calcium that will be circulating in our blood. So when our blood calcium levels change, then we may have some hormonal and we may have some hormonal regulation occur. So we need these blood calcium levels to help us with our cardiac, our nerve, and enzyme and blood physiology. So to regulate the calcium levels in our blood, we have parathyroid hormone and we have calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone will be secreted by our parathyroid gland, and it is secreted when our blood calcium levels are decreased. So because it is secreted when our blood calcium levels are decreased, this parathyroid hormone will work to increase our blood calcium levels. And it will do so by osteoclastic activity. So remember, we've said that osteoclasts go into the bone and they begin to break it down. So by breaking down the bone, they release the calcium from being stored within the bone, and then that calcium can then travel into the bloodstream to raise our blood calcium levels. This parathyroid hormone will also cause the kidneys to release calcitriol. Calcitriol will cause us to increase our calcium absorption in the intestines. So both of these methods here will work to increase our blood levels of calcium. Now, on the other hand, if our blood levels of calcium are low, if our blood levels of calcium are high and we need to decrease the blood calcium levels, our thyroid gland will secrete calcitonin. So the thyroid gland secretes calcitonin in response to high blood calcium levels. Calcitonin will decrease our blood calcium. So parathyroid hormone works to increase and calcitonin works to decrease. These are both going to be negative feedback systems. The mechanism is here. And you can also watch it as an animation here. Now, as we exercise and as we age, we have our bone tissue altering its strength in response to mechanical stretches. So within some limits, of course, we can alter the strength based on the mechanical stresses we put on our body. So that would be the exercise. And it can increase how much mineral salts are deposited in our bone, and it can help to increase the production of our collagen fibers. So that's why this mechanical stress or this exercise is good for us to build strong bones. So if you fracture your bones and you go through physical therapy, they are creating mechanical stresses to help with that deposit of the mineral salts and the production of collagen fibers to increase or create a stronger bone. And then as we do weight-bearing activities such as walking, moderate weightlifting, these help us build and even retain our bone mass. So as we age, it's important to continue these things. And then generally a lot of times as we age, we would remove our mechanical stresses. So that's why we want to keep doing them. And if we remove the mechanical stresses though, then we begin to weaken the bone through a process of demineralization where we lose those minerals, and the collagen production is also reduced as we age. So we lose our calcium. So as we go through aging, From birth to adolescence, we have more bone production than we are actually losing through the process of remodeling. So remember, remodeling is constantly replacing the bone. So birth through adolescence, we're producing more bone than we are going through and losing with the remodeling process. And pretty much the same thing is happening in our adult body, except for here we are going through that process of remodeling, but we're able to keep up or produce enough through remodeling that we're not losing bone. However, when we get to be older, especially in postmenopausal women, we decrease in bone mass because our resorption of bone outplaces the deposit. So, at this point, we are having more osteoclastic activities with a C, osteoclastic activity, than we are osteoblastic with a B activity. So the two main effects here as we age are going to be demineralization, that loss of calcium and other minerals from the bone. That can lead to our osteoporosis. And then we also decrease the rate at which we synthesize our proteins. So especially important protein here is the collagen that we need to have in our ground matrix for the bones. And so this makes us more susceptible to fractures. So these are all some factors that affect bone growth. We talked about them when we were talking about the things we needed for our bone to grow, whether we were adults or children. So you'll see those there. And then as we age, as we are talking about bone, what kind of homeostatic imbalances do we have? Well, we have our bone scans that we can use diagnostically because bone is an actual living tissue. So we can use this scan to see the density of bone, how much bone is there, see what kind of activity is going on. Are we actively growing and remodeling our bone, or is there breakdown activity going on? And then osteoporosis, we've heard of, but this is where we decrease the amount and the strength in the bone tissue, mainly because of our decreases in hormonal output. And so during osteoporosis, the bone reabsorption or that osteoclastic activity outpaces the bone formation or that osteoblastic activity, and so we lose the density. And then rickets and osteomalacia, these are both disorders in which the bone fails to calcify, typically due to a vitamin deficiency. Not commonly seen really anymore in our developed countries. So this brings us to the end of our bone lecture. Please make sure that you know about bone formation and the types of bone that exist, as well as how it is going to maintain our calcium balance throughout the body.